Hey, I am Lee Wright. Good evening. Thanks for joining us on Facebook. And with me from Virginia is?
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History. I'm in Virginia, and with us tonight is Ted Widmer, historian and author, and he is with us to talk about Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, Ted.
So we're excited to have you with us, and we're going to spend time, and we're also going to answer questions that folks have. I also want to mention just very quickly something that we're going to talk more about at the end tonight, and that's something new coming up on August 1, America's Summer Road Trip. We're going to announce more details tonight and more details still on Saturday. All right, Ted. So thank you. You know, I think few people have had as many books written about them as Lincoln. I think it's fascinating the way that you chose to come about, to kind of get into the topic, understand Lincoln, and do so through a unique way. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your approach, kind of what you brought to it, or what brought you to that, and what you found through your research?
Yeah, well, thank you, Lee. I'm so happy to be part of History Camp tonight. I wish there'd been a history camp for me to go to when I was a teenager. I was forced to go to camps where they made us do these terrible things like play kickball and swim and play. I just wanted to read Johnny Tremaine, you know. But anyway, I've been thinking about Lincoln for a long time. I grew up as a kid fascinated by him and by the Civil War. I later was a White House speechwriter, and you go around Washington, his words are chiseled into stone everywhere you look. And so I wondered how he got there. How did this guy with almost the least education of any American president become the writer of our sacred truths? And I looked more and more analytically at the question, and I began to realize a whole lot happened on his train trip in from Springfield to Washington to become the president. Usually trips of presidents are kind of predictable. They have ceremonial stops. They give a few speeches. They're not that interesting. In Lincoln's case, it's really an incredible trial. It's an ordeal where he's got to travel a very long distance, meet with difficult politicians, put his cabinet together, try to pretend that the country isn't falling apart, although it is, and work out what he needs to say to the American people to keep them together. And over 13 days, he remarkably began to find the words, these incredible words that we will never forget. They're imperishable. And I felt that by the end of the trip, he's giving speeches that are just a tad below the level of Gettysburg, but they're close to it. So how that happened, how he found his voice, how he met millions of Americans, how he dodged a very lethal assassination attempt were all part of the magic of this book for me.
That's fascinating. Help set the stage. What shape was the country in? There'd been this election. What was the feeling about the outcome? And talk to us about where things kind of fraying and starting to perhaps unravel.
Well, he won on November 6, 1860. He becomes the president. He wins a majority of the electoral votes. He actually wins a very small plurality of the popular vote. He wins less than 40%, which is a very low number. And if you think about how famous Lincoln is, and then reflect on how small a number of people actually voted for him, it's kind of incredible. He won the second smallest percentage of the vote any American president ever has after John Quincy Adams in 1824. So he's behind the eight ball in almost every way. He's barely won. Half the country is leaving because he won. The North is not that excited. I mean, some people are, but a lot of people are not. There are a lot of Northerners who don't vote for Lincoln. And the Republican Party is a brand new party. He's a former Whig, but the Republican Party is kind of a mess of different elements, and he's got to put it all together. And the means of doing that are not very easy. He's way out there in Springfield, Illinois, very far to the west of Washington and New York, where the country's power centers are. So he's got to improvise and the amazing thing is that he succeeds. He becomes Abraham Lincoln. He becomes the greatest president in our history. And yet at the beginning of the trip, that seemed like the most unlikely prospect imaginable.
So how was the trip put together? One doesn't, I think one naturally expects the journey from home to Washington as being almost part of a campaign for his policies that he's going to work to put in place.
Well, he tried to have a well-organized trip. He's a well-organized guy, and he writes out formal speeches to give to the state legislatures in all the state capitals that he's expecting to go through. But the nature of the trip was chaotic. He had to stop every few miles. People were so curious about where the country was headed and what he would do that he had to speak all the time. He had to give 20, 30, 40 speeches a day off the cuff. And in those improvisatory moments, he's like a jazz musician. He starts riffing, and there's great beauty in that. And you start to see this other Lincoln who's not so well prepared, but who cares very deeply about his country and its history, and begins to kind of sing a song. He begins to sing the song of the Declaration of Independence and its promise of equality to all people, which strongly implies racial equality and, in the fullness of time, gender equality. And, not everyone fully understands all of that, but he stays with the Declaration and says, this is who we are. We are an inclusive people. We believe in the right to liberty, to the pursuit of happiness. And all of that implies that African Americans are a part of this complicated country. And he says it in beautiful ways over and over and over again. So even in all the chaos of the journey, there's something working beautifully inside of him, in which he's singing this song of inclusivity for all Americans. And the North responds. Even though he's a minority president with less than 40% of the vote, people like the way he's talking about American history. Jefferson Davis is on a train of his own at the same time. You never hear a peep from him about the Declaration or the Constitution. It's just, give me my right, we're seceding. Lincoln has a bigger vision, and I think that is why he prevailed.
Give us a little sense of, you said more than 100 speeches. Stopping along the way, what sort of crowds did he meet, and to what extent were crowds receptive versus perhaps hostile?
Well, they were mainly just fascinated. He's the biggest political celebrity, and that is a word that had been used in the 1850s. He's the biggest celebrity to that point. So people just come out in enormous numbers, often more than the entire population of a town or a city would be there at trackside to watch him come in. And part of it is visual. They want to see what he looks like. He looks odd. He's tall and famously unkempt. His suits don't fit him very well. He's got this odd body language where he might sort of stretch his arms, and he kind of acts like a farmer more than a politician, and people like that. It works for him. So in both small towns and big cities, huge crowds come out, and he's always he's got this endless repository of anecdotes that he can tell. He can tell funny stories, and he's good at that. He's almost a stand-up comedian. I mean, that concept doesn't exist, but he's good at making people laugh. But then he's also good at sort of settling things down and saying, we're in a lot of trouble. This is the biggest crisis since the American Revolution. I'm going to do the best I can. I need your help. And he involves the people in his journey. So as he goes through a town, all those people, even if they didn't vote for him, they feel an interest in his survival. And there are already rumors that people are trying to kill him. And in fact, that turns out to be true. There are people trying to kill him. And the survival of Abraham Lincoln on this almost 2,000-mile journey becomes a metaphor for the survival of the United States and of democracy worldwide.
That's fascinating. Did you find his speeches, obviously they kind of evolved and so forth as you described. To what extent did you see changes based on maybe geography kind of playing to an audience, having a theme or particular focus, one area versus another?
Well, geography is actually a huge part of this book. I don't know if it was a curse or a blessing, but I had access to Google Earth and Google Maps while thinking about his train journey. So I literally just poured over every mile of the trip, 1,904 miles. And I mean, I often had a magnifying glass looking at my laptop to figure out where the train tracks went, and did it go near a lake or near a hill? And did Lincoln see it, or was there a little factory there in 1861? And I was cross-checking with the old maps, and it was just so fun to think about the diversity of the landscape, not just the diversity of the people, but it's a diverse land with places with hilltops where you're not going to have big farms, and then cities on rivers, cities on canals, cities that have risen up very quickly, like Buffalo, fascinating city. State capitals are a little different. And I just really wanted the reader to get a feeling for each stop of the journey. So I paid a lot of attention to local newspapers. And, if I contributed anything new, as you mentioned, there are a lot of books about Lincoln, and I, one hesitates to even try a new one, but I really read the local newspapers carefully so I could feel what every local town was thinking as Lincoln came through.
Fascinating. What did you see in that coverage? And where I imagine some of the bigger cities, you had papers on both sides of an issue?
Yeah, well, that's for sure. I mean, New York is a huge northern city. It's not very clearly in the north. It's got extensive commercial relationships with the South, and the mayor of New York is a complicated character named Fernando Wood, who you can see in the Spielberg movie Lincoln, kind of an odious New York politician, and he's dangling out the possibility that New York might become either a northern hub of the Confederacy or a neutral city, whatever that means. And there are a lot of Southern sympathizers in every northern city that he goes through, just like there are a lot of people who love America and love the Union throughout the South. It's a very fluid situation. It's not just red states against blue states. In each state, there are people working it out. In each city, and often in each house, there are people working it out. So he just brilliantly talks to each city as if he's one of them. And in many places he is. In Indianapolis, he can speak as a kid who grew up in Indianapolis. In Cincinnati, he can speak as a friend of many people. He knows many people in Cincinnati. It's on the Ohio River, which is a river he has worked on as a flatboat pilot. He knows the Ohio River. And he just, every place he says the perfect right thing. And he reminds them all they're part of this very large experiment, that sometimes you have to rise above your selfish local concerns and remember that you're in this for a bigger reason. We then and we are now trying to show the world that democracy works. And he says that if we allow people to reject an election and just like leave a country because they don't like the fact that I won, that's no democracy. That's a bogus democracy. And it's bogus anyway to leave because you don't like an election. It's especially bogus if the reason for your anger is because of slavery, this anti-democratic labor system that denies people any chance to vote or have any existence, not allowed to get married, not allowed to have birth certificates or death certificates. They have no existence in the state. So Lincoln is speaking beautifully about what democracy means and what America means to the world, but he's very focused on the specific threat of slavery to the United States of America in 1861.
Were there many instances where the speech was reprinted verbatim, or having been taken down and printed?
Absolutely. So, I mean, even though it's a long time ago, there's a pretty modern communications system in place. The telegraph is invented in 1844, and it has spread to the north and the south, but it spread more to the north than to the south. And I talk in the book about the differential. The north and south have trains and they have telegraphs, but in the north it's exploding. Everywhere has it. In the south, it's sort of moving slowly and grudgingly. They're not that excited about it because free information threatens a labor system based on the suppression of information, slavery. So the telegraph works better in the north and the train works better in the north. And I explain why that's true. But yeah, from the beginning of the trip, Lincoln's words are being beamed around the country, and that's part of why the trip was so effective. So as he's leaving in Springfield, Illinois, he gives a beautiful speech. It probably lasted 1 minute, a very short speech about loving his neighbors and living among them for 25 years and sharing life's joys and tragedies. And he says, 3 of my children were born here, 1 is buried here. It's a haunting moment. And he thanks them, and then he talks about the challenge facing him. And in my research, I found out how many death threats were already coming into him before he left Springfield. And I believe he was saying goodbye, knowing that he wasn't coming back. I mean, I say that speculatively, but the more I looked into that speech, the more I thought, this is a sad person who knows he's not going to make it back alive to his hometown. And that proved to be true. And all the words of that speech are beamed across America the next day. And it was a very effective way to begin the speech and sort of show that he's not a divisive person. He's the opposite. He's a guy from a small town who loves his neighbors. He's just trying to keep it all together. And it was a brilliant first speech to give.
Well, that's fascinating. Now, give us a little more of a sense. Were these situations where the train stops, people gather, Lincoln comes out? Were there politicians introducing him, other local individuals involved? And I also want to touch on the threat to his physical safety. What provisions were there with the train itself or in each town to provide security?
There are local politicians everywhere. They're coming out in droves to welcome him. And that's sort of a pleasure and a burden for Lincoln. They all want to talk about themselves, basically. And there are some very funny moments in the trip where local politicians are giving him, I mean, they had a system. If it was a big town, you get 5 minutes of Lincoln. If it was a tiny town, you get 1 minute. And some towns that were 1 minute towns thought they were 5 minute towns. And so a mayor or someone, chairman of some local committee, would start welcoming Lincoln and giving a long speech, and Lincoln would just stand there. And then after 1 minute, the train would start to pull away. And I mean, so there, that's democracy. In 1861, they're working it out. Some receptions went well, some went very badly. There were some places where artillery was discharged so close to the train that windows shattered on the train onto the Lincolns. And, nobody had ever seen a presidential passage as exciting as this. It was, I don't want to say it was a rock tour, but it had some elements of the celebrity coming in and the town going crazy for 5 minutes, and then the celebrity moves out again. But then as the trip is continuing, and to answer the second part of your question, they are getting intelligence that there's a very serious plot to assassinate him in Baltimore. Some of the rumors center on Washington, some on Baltimore, more on Baltimore. So even as he's in this very exposed situation, minute after minute, going out and talking to people, get as close to him as they want, he's hearing all the time that people want to kill him in Baltimore, Maryland. So they've got to figure out how to get him through a pretty southern city on the way to Washington. And the way they figure out to do that is he takes an ordinary passenger train in the middle of the night. It goes through Baltimore about 4 a.m. with only 3 people in his passenger compartment with him. And if he hadn't made it, American history would be completely different. I'm not sure the Civil War would have turned out the way it did.
That's fascinating. So we referred to the Lincolns. So he has his whole family with him on the train, the rest of the journey at least. And any insights from interactions with his family, and were there any implications from him traveling with his family? And while at the same time he was campaigning for these ideas that he wanted to go forward with and see the nation remain united.
Well, he's happy that his family are with him, but they give him headaches too. He's got 3 sons on the trip. He's got his older son, Robert, who nearly loses the only copy of his inaugural address, which is one of the most important speeches he ever gave. He gives Robert the inaugural address in a little leather satchel, and he just goes and stashes it behind a hotel desk in Indianapolis. And Lincoln, a couple hours later, says, "Where's my speech?" And Robert tells him that, and Lincoln turns white in the face and runs down and jumps over the desk and starts opening every satchel in the baggage compartment of this hotel until he actually found it. But Robert nearly lost this crucial speech that Lincoln needed to give. And his younger kids are very mischievous, Tad and Willie. They're having the time of their lives. They will go up to strangers and say, "Would you like to see Old Abe?" That's Lincoln's nickname. People will say yes, and then they'll point to a stranger, not Lincoln. And so he's not totally in control of his own family, let alone the country. And I made the mistake in an early televised interview of saying it reminded me a little bit of some of the Chevy Chase National Lampoon Vacation movies, where he's just trying to get where he's going, but his family is undermining him a little bit while he's on the train. He loves them, of course, but they're making his every day a little bit harder than it needs to be.
Interesting. Now, Ted, you mentioned your earlier career as a presidential speechwriter. So that's a particularly interesting lens through which to view these speeches. Perhaps a historian with a different background would look at them as simply kind of historic objects. You understand how difficult it is to craft.
Yeah.
Were all of these written by Lincoln himself? Were there others contributing at all?
Well, to be really specific, he wrote out about 1 speech per day of these 13 days. But then in reality, the pressure was so great that he had to give, like 20 speeches a day. So 1 would be written, formal, usually delivered in a formal setting, like to a legislature in a state capitol. And then as the train's pulling through a town, he just goes out there and wings it. And that's all him. But the first inaugural address, this very important speech that was nearly lost, he's showing that to a small number of political advisors, and every adjective is incredibly important. And on the trip, there's 1 word that an Illinois politician advises him to change. He's talking about the right of the US government to reclaim its property in the South. And that means a federal fort, like Fort Sumter, belongs to the US. It doesn't belong to South Carolina. It belongs to the United States. But if you talk about reclaiming it, it sounds like you're going to send in troops to protect it, which sounds like an invasion of South Carolina. And so a word like hold is a much better word. Hold is better than reclaim, because hold is like we're just keeping it the same as it's ever been. Reclaim is like we're going in with guns to take it back. So that is one single word that got changed on the trip. But then as he's nearing the end, he's working out this beautiful final paragraph, which we all still think about. And Lincoln didn't co-write a lot of his speeches, but William Seward, his future Secretary of State and his rival for the nomination, if you read Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals, Seward is the main rival. They beautifully come together as co-writers of this final paragraph of the first inaugural, in which Seward drafts a very good first draft of a final paragraph about all of us being part of the same country. Southerners and Northerners, we're all part of the same country. And it's great. And then Lincoln takes this A-level draft and he sends it up above A+ into one of the greatest paragraphs ever written. And that includes the famous phrase about the better angels of our nature. And I think Lincoln actually needed Seward. We all admire and love Lincoln. I do. But it helps, a little help from your friends now and then is pretty useful. And Seward had a great idea for that final paragraph. And Lincoln embroidered it. He made it better, but it was Seward's idea in the first place.
Well, that's fascinating. So I want to switch gears for just a minute and ask you one or two questions about your earlier career, because I think all of us who love history have read speeches, have seen speeches, and so forth. Tell us a little bit about the process to write a speech for a president.
Well, I had the good fortune to be hired as a White House speechwriter in 1997, and I had pretty much no experience. I came in, I was a history grad student, and I liked 19th century American history, which is why I'm back in this topic now. But I had been writing a bit for the public. I wrote for George magazine, you might remember, started by John Kennedy Jr., who I admired tremendously. And I was starting to try to write in a more public way. And I met someone who was already a Clinton speechwriter. And he said they wouldn't mind having someone come in with some history chops. I had not gone to history camp, but I'd been studying a lot of history. And so I came in and it was all totally new, but it was so interesting. There were actually two speech writing offices. One was for domestic politics and one was for foreign policy. And I came into the foreign policy office. I didn't have very much of a background in that, but that's where the job was. So I went, and I later was very happy to be in that office. I liked my fellow foreign policy speechwriters a lot. And I liked the head of that office, and I liked the national security advisor of that time, Sandy Berger. And we all cared a lot about US foreign policy. And it was in the middle to late 1990s when there was still a feeling that the Cold War had ended pretty recently. And there was this opening in the world where democracy could spread. And we were trying to help it spread in difficult places like the Balkans. And Bill Clinton went on very long trips, Africa and India and Southeast Asia, to try to just sort of tell people democracy is okay. You can trust it. It's going to be good for you. And that was a wonderful time. I mean, we got a lot of things wrong. I mean, you have to look back with humility and kind of amazement at some of the hubris of that time. But we were in love with the story of the United States of America and with the promise of democracy and the idea that a new century was coming in which all people, Nelson Mandela had walked out of prison and become the president of South Africa, all people could really govern themselves and live up to the ideas of the founding fathers of this country, but all people on earth could do that. So even though I wasn't a foreign policy specialist, I loved it. It was so exciting, and I really admired my colleagues. And I thought Bill Clinton was on his game. It was a strange time, to put it mildly, because we also had the Lewinsky scandal and impeachment, but he was speaking brilliantly to foreign audiences about his ideas about democracy and where they ought to go, each country in their future. And his own personal ratings were very high in spite of the crisis at home. So it was like a chance in a lifetime to work in a White House. And I've never been back to one since. It was just that one time. But I began to think seriously about the great presidents of the past. And I think almost all of us, Republican and Democrats, still put Lincoln at the top of that pile. And so I remember reading Lincoln at Gettysburg by Gary Wills and just loving it. And in some ways, this book is different, but in some ways it repeats certain ideas from Gary Wills' Lincoln at Gettysburg.
Well, that's fascinating. I hope you'll consider coming. We talked about History Camp a couple times, or references a couple times. I hope you'll consider coming and joining us and speaking at one of our History Camps.
I sure will. As long as I don't have to play any kickball, I'm happy.
So this has been so interesting. Carrie, do we have some questions that folks have asked that we want to learn more?
Can you talk a little bit more about the death threats that he had and kind of how that was avoided?
Well, so that was fascinating to me. I'd heard rumors of some difficulty in Baltimore, but I didn't realize it was as advanced a threat as it was. And there was a huge number of people, pro-Southern people in Baltimore. I mean, Maryland is a complicated state. I lived in Maryland for 6 years, and I love Maryland, and I love Baltimore. It's a great city. But in 1860 and 61, it is a very Southern city. It considers itself, it's got a nickname, the metropolis of the South. It's the biggest city in the South. It's actually to the north of the capital, Washington, but it's a very Southern city with slaves. Frederick Douglass is a slave in Baltimore before he escapes on a train, and just a lot of money in Baltimore, a lot of pro-slavery people in Baltimore. And when Lincoln wins, that becomes the point where people decide they want to kill him before he can become president. And there is a certain logic to that because Baltimore has 3 train stations. They're all about a mile apart from each other. And if you're coming in from the north, you have to get off your train and get in a horse and buggy and go a distance to catch the train at the next station. And it was in one of those transfers that they were going to surround his carriage and kill him with knives and guns and explosive devices. And it appears pretty likely that the police was in on it, that they were sort of understaffing his arrival. And there were ships nearby in the harbor that were ready to take the people away. And there may have been as many as 1,000 people in on this plot. And what happened is, I'm really happy to have some women in this story. A really fearless woman named Dorothea Dix, who is a mental health advocate. She's from New England, but she's popular around the country because she's done so much good in every state. She's helped them build basically mental hospitals. Every state has them. It's kind of a beautiful equalizing idea that we all need to take care of our people in the same way. And she helped Southern states to do that. And there's later a famous quote about South Carolina at the height of the secession crisis, that it's too small to be a country, it's too big to be an insane asylum. And that is a funny line from 1861, but in fact, Dorothea Dix is actually working on mental health in South Carolina. And when she's there, she begins to hear from some of her friends that there is a very well-developed plot to kill Lincoln on his last leg of his train route through Baltimore into Washington. So she goes on her own to the president of the railroad that will deliver Lincoln, and she tells him, and he hires a group of railroad detectives, including Alan Pinkerton, who later helps to found the Secret Service. But he brings 7 operatives with him. One of them is an incredibly brave and talented female spy named Kate Warney, who isn't in very many history books, but she gets a lot of intelligence about the plot. And she is sent by Pinkerton to tell Lincoln and his people, you cannot go through Baltimore in daylight because they're going to kill you. So Dorothea Dix discovers the plot. Kate Warney is the agent on the ground. She impersonates a Southerner and gets all this intelligence. And because they know so much about the plotters, they finally persuade Lincoln, who doesn't want to do it, to go through in the middle of the night. And I think these 2 women basically saved his life.
Well, that is fascinating. So can you talk a little bit about Washington being the capital? Do you feel like that was a great place for the capital?
Washington was then and remains a terrible choice for the capital of the United States. I'm just going to put it out there, Carrie. The decision, so the first capital, when George Washington is sworn in, he's sworn in a place called Federal Hall on Wall Street in New York. And I understand why New York couldn't become the capital. It's got so many other strong qualities, and it's not quite yet the financial capital, but it's going to become that. And so it then goes to Philadelphia for 10 years, and that was a pretty good capital, I think. Philadelphia is actually very close to the South, but it's a quasi-northern city. It's only 15 miles from Delaware, where there are slaves. So it's, that I think would have been a good capital for all time. I think Baltimore might have been a good capital. I think Havre de Grace, Maryland might have been a very good capital. That's a small town at the head of Chesapeake Bay, but geographically, it's a very interesting place where a northern river, the Susquehanna River, flows into a southern body of water, Chesapeake Bay. We might have built a beautiful capital there, but instead it kept going south, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison worked out a deal with Alexander Hamilton in a secret dinner party that they would give Hamilton approval of his economic program if Hamilton would agree to relocate the capital to the banks of the Potomac River near George Washington's home. And Hamilton is very close to George Washington, so I get why that was acceptable to him, but it really was a setback for democracy. It meant we were putting our capital of this democratic country hundreds of miles behind the Mason-Dixon line and deep in slavery territory, so deep that it would basically be impossible to ever eliminate slavery in the capital of the United States. And many people tried, including Abraham Lincoln during his 1 term as congressman. It just couldn't be done. It was a slave-holding city, and that was part of the point. The South wanted the capital to be a slave-holding city, but it's also just a bad city for growth and trade and development. The Potomac River, which is a very beautiful river to look at, is a horrible river to do business on. It's very shallow. There are a lot of shifting shoals in the river. Ships can't get up it very easily. So just like the most basic thing of bringing a ship up to load it with some goods to take it out and then around the world, you can't do there. It's a fake city. The only thing that was good about it was near Mount Vernon and George Washington. And so there was a prestige factor, but it's this literally swampy city. It's called the Swamp. And it was a swamp, and it still is a swamp. It's a low-lying city with no capacity to send goods out by ships. And so for a long time in our history, it's a kind of underperforming place.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, Jack would like to know, was there any one person who was overseeing the trip to Washington on behalf of Lincoln?
There was a supervisor of the journey, and this just calls out how dangerous it was. His name was William Wood, and he was a guy who'd worked on railroads, and he was brought to Lincoln by some New York allies, William Seward, and there's a guy named Thurlow Weed, who's sort of the political boss of New York. And it seems like William Wood was a pretty shifty character, that he planned out the route, but he had all these side projects that he was working on for his own financial advancement. He was working on Mary Todd Lincoln quite successfully and promising her expensive presents if she would hire friends of his in the Lincoln. So he's basically corrupt. And he's the guy running the train that Lincoln is on. So Lincoln is surrounded by danger everywhere he is. And when at the end of the trip, Lincoln took the advice of Pinkerton and went secretly in the middle of the night on the ordinary passenger train to get to Washington, they didn't even tell William Wood. They didn't even tell the boss of the train trip, because they felt like he might be corrupt, or he might be in league with the Southern plotters.
That is fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Ted. This has been absolutely fascinating. Like Lee had mentioned, I've started your book. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm so excited. It is a great read.
Thank you.
And if any of you would like to pick this up, it's a fantastic read. You can get this on our website, historycamp.org/online. And we will look forward to seeing you in March.
Can I say one thing? If anyone didn't get a chance to ask a question, I just want to give out my email, because it's fine with me if people write me. It's Ted_Widmer, Widmer @brown.edu. And I want to give a shout out to my friend Maureen O'Donnell in New Bedford, Massachusetts, who told me she was going to be listening tonight.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, that's great. Carrie, do you have any more wrap up?
Yes, I'm sorry. My computer keeps dropping me here. Thank you so much, everyone. We are looking forward to seeing you next week, July 2nd. We'll be talking with Lindsay Chervinsky about George Washington and the creation of the cabinet. So that will be great. And in the meantime, we will be working on America's Summer Road Trip. I hope you will join us for that. You can find out more at americasummerroadtrip.org. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Lee. Have a good night,
Carrie.
everyone.
Thank you, Lee.
All right.